So, alright guys, in this tutorial what we're gonna do is like last time we saw around how to create a counter and we made an increment operation on the counter. So this time what we're gonna do is like we're gonna actually create the NFT and use this counter for a token ID. You know. So for that what I have created is like I've created this contract, the NFT contract, but the naming is file naming is not right. Okay, the file should have an SOL file format for any validity contract. And that being said, let's actually go into the contract and what we need to implement. So, like I said, we're going to be using openzeppelin contract implementation for this. So the first thing we need is like the ERC721 SOL from the tokens directory. Then we're going to be using our own implementation of counter, not the counter from the openzeppelin. So for that, I believe like you have already followed this tutorial and found out how to create this counter. So for this, what we're going to do is like just going to implement, invoke this, import this iCounter interface. For that, what we'll be doing is like the import operation. Then we need to get into this directory, counter directory. Then there's a file called iCounter.fos. So if you guys have any doubt whether we have imported the correct file or not, you can just click on control and click on the file name. It will directly go to that file that you imported. So this works for everything, like even the openzeppelin from Node.js. If you click on control and click on the file name, it will go to the file. It will go to the actual implementation of this file. So okay, then what we need to do is like this NFT counter is actually an implementation of ERC721. So what we're going to do is we're going to say like which is the count the construct the the contract which we are creating is actually an ERC721 that's coming from an openzeppelin library. So I'm just gonna extend this the contract that we have created as ERC721. Then there are a few things that we need to add. First thing is like the counter. We have already deployed this counter to an address. So what I did is like I've just taken the address of this counter contract and I've saved it in a command line. We can just copy it. Or let me come here. You can even pass it as a parameter, but my preference would be to have this as a private variable. We'll call it as counter address. And I'm going to assign the address which I have for the counter. This one. Number two, let's go ahead with the constructor. Constructor is going to have two parameters. One is, so everything is going to be memory because I don't want to like override the program. So name and symbol. So I'm assigning the constructor as public, and I'm going to use, inherit the ERC721 over here to one. Yeah. And it's going to take in these two parameters, name and symbol. Yeah. So actually what will happen is like, even if we deploy this contract, this is going to be this is going to be deployed fine because we have this base implementation coming from openzeppelin. They have a very minimal implementation for this 721 contracts. But what we need is like we need to set a token URI. This token URI is what we spoke in the last session. It's going to come from the IPFS. So this is the data that the NFT is going to carry, and it has to be assigned to a token ID. That's why we are using this counter basically. So for that, what we need is like we need a mapping. This mapping is going to be between a token ID and token URL. Okay. Token URL. So how do we create a mapping? It's like just a mapping. not plus u in 256, because if you look at the documentation, EIP, it's gonna say like the token ID should be u in 256. And having a string here, let's do a private mapping. So the reason I'm going to override this is because if you look at the ERC721, just need to close this. Sometimes it happens. So if you look at the ERC721, this itself already has a mapping for tokenURI. So what I'm going to do is like, I'm going to override this, and I'm going to say like, okay, my contract is going to have this tokenURI. Let me not use it from the openzeppelin. So that's what I'm going to do here. And the next thing is, okay, we have the mapping ready. The next thing is we're going to set a tokenURI. For that, we have a function. There is a function that we are going to inherit from the base class. Before that, let's create our own implementation of it. So we're going to set tokenURI. For this, we need to have a couple of parameters. Number one, we need to have the token ID. Number two, we need to have, I believe we guessed it correctly, tokenURI. I'm going to call it as tokenURI, and then I'm going to do it as public. So here there is a catch. So what I'm going to do is like, not everyone can set a tokenURI except the owner or the person who's, or the address which has been approved to do this operation. For that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a check. This check is going to say like, yes, approved or owner. This approved or owner is actually coming from the base of ERC721 implementation. For this, what I'm going to do with the spender is the actual message.sender. The person who is calling this method, and the token ID is actually the token ID. I'm not going to change anything. It shouldn't be me. So the message which I'm going to display here is like ERC721 transfer caller is not owner or approved. I misspelled approved. Okay, approved. I need to close this require with that here. Then what I'm going to do is like, the basic operation of the set URI is actually to set a token URI to a token ID. For that only we created this mapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mapping, and I'm going to point it to the token ID. Value is going to store this token URI underscore token URI. Yeah. Right. Perfect. Okay, this doesn't solve the actual problem. So there's another thing what we need to do is like, we can basically call the set token URI instead of doing like this. The reason I'm doing this way is because I just wanted to use my mapping rather than using the mapping from the ERC721. So what I mean is like, you go to this method, the file, you search for token URI. We're going to have the same thing here. The only difference is like, I'm going to use my mapping. Just overwritten just the new name. That's it. It's the only difference. Then the function we need to implement is like, we need to get the token URI. So that's how we actually display the information in our platform. So we can do it by token ID. This is just a new function, and it's going to return a string, which is a memory string. And what it's going to do is like, it's going to just return the token URI or token ID. this is something weird because tokenURI, the name I've given. Okay. I think let's get back to this function in a moment. So we'll understand what we are actually doing here after we create the NFT. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function to create the actual NFT. This is where I'm actually going to mint and transfer it to the actual owner. I'm going to have a memory. So this meta URI is the actual token URI which I'm going to use, and I'm going to have another parameter. I'm going to say to whom the NFT has to be transferred. So I'll let you guys know why I'm doing like this, because what I wanted to do in the end is like I wanted to create a factory where it's going to clone this actual NFT contract and send it to the actual person who is minting the contract on the platform. So that is my idea here. So that's why I'm just adding a address to parameter in the create method. So next thing what we need is like we need the token ID. For that we're going to use the counter, and the counter interface needs the counter address. And what we're going to do is like we're just directly going to call the increment method. What it's going to do is like it's just going to call the increment and kick it the counter to a next value, and we need that counter value here. So we're going to do is like we're going to take that counter value in a count variable. We're going to use the same counter interface. Maybe you can just store this in a different variable and your personal preference. Done. So we have the count now. The token ID is like the next increment of the counter. And what I'm going to do is like I'm going to use the mint method that's coming from the ERC721, and I'm going to mint it to the sender. Then this requires a counter. I believe the counter is actually 256. So what this function is going to do is like it's going to actually mint the NFT here. Once that is done, I think we need to do one more operation. We need to call the set token URI. That's where the actual metadata is given to the is set to the actual NFT that we minted just now. So for that, I'm going to call token URI. The token ID is the count. Token URI is the meta URI. So maybe you can just return the count here. So I have just written it as count. Or you may not return anything if you are looking the way of doing it. So what I will be doing is like I'll be adding another function here. We'll be using a transfer method. In this implementation, we are not doing it. The reason is because we have not implemented any factory yet. Here, we're going to have to come. Yeah. We'll enable this once we have the factory, because the reason is when we're doing it with the factory, message.sender is the address of the factory. The 2 is the address of the actual person who's calling the factory. So what happens is like the factory contract will actually call the NFT, and the NFT will be minted to the factory. Then it has to be transferred to the person who's actually calling the factory method. That's why we are having this. Then let me set down. Yeah. So one last thing we need to do is like we need to actually get the token URI. You can get it by. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually first, there are like multiple ways to send this thing. So I don't think we can directly send a mapping output like this. What we need to do is like first we need to get the token URI to a memory variable. then you can return it like this. You convert it into a string. You can have the ABA encoding packet. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send tokenId.2. That's going to be very complicated. Oh no, directly sorry, I just missed it. Just have to directly send the tokenURI. I believe this is it. So if you want to have a base URL, what you can do is like you can just encode the base URI here. Then you can, before that you can set the base URI. But I believe this will, yeah, I'm just checking one last time if we have missed anything. No, then let's go ahead and do the deployment script for this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply copy this counter deployment script and I'm going to add a new one. NFT.yes. So here what we need is like, we may not need counter, we're going to call it as NFT contract. Let's use the name NFT. And then NFT contract. Okay. So for the factory, we're going to have the NFT contract. I think it's NFT contract. Yes. The contract. It's going to be deployed. If it's deployed, it's going to get the address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the contract using, okay, to deploy it, and we need to supply a couple of parameters. Let's do that in a moment. So once the contract has been created, I'm going to use JavaScript sensor to actually mint it. Let's do that. I think that would be interesting. So the name I'm going to use is like NFT. Symbol is NFT. Okay. Fine. The console here. So I'm going to use the Galleon version, and I'm going to first compile it. So while it's compiling, let me put it on always on top. Okay, while it's compiling, what I don't want here is like, I don't want to have the creator.sol, because that's just a sample, the boilerplate code that comes with the Hardhat. And even in the artifacts, when you look at it, it's not going to affect anything, but the build timing, I'm worried about it. So it's just having the ABI for the creator.sol. For now, let's leave it. When I'm uploading this to the GitHub, I'll be deleting it actually. So everything has been compiled. So now it's time for us to deploy this NFT. Let's open the deploy script again. So I need to run this script, the NFT contract.ts. So how I'm going to do is, like I said, the HH means I've created an alias, says npx hardhat. I do not want to type npx hardhat every time that I'm running this command, so I just do it like this. So the network is Mumbai. Yeah. And script is from the scripts npx NFT contract. Yes. I think, okay, let's before that, while it's happening, let's go ahead and verify everything once. The contact address is correct. The name and symbol, and setting the token URI, we're getting the token URI, it is encoding it. All right. So this is the address. We can copy it. Let me just save it somewhere. So okay, I forgot to did this counter deploy too. Okay, so bear with me. Sorry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to interact with this contract. Before that, let's go to the. It's always on top. Okay, let's go to the polygon scan. This is my wallet address. I'm just going to check. Okay, this is not reflected yet. Okay, it's going to take some time. Okay, meanwhile, what I'm going to do is like we'll get a console. The Mumbai network. Yeah. So here we have the contract created. Let's go to this transaction and take a look at it. This will be like a simple contract because we have not ran any mint operation on this. Let's do it and let's see what's happening when we do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the NFT contract instance. So we're going to get the contract using the factory. Then what we're going to do is like we need to attach this contract with the address what we got now. That's I'm going to have the NFT await. This is the address for the NFT contract. So this is where the magic happens. What I'm going to do is like I'm just going to create it with two parameters. We're actually using one. We're not using the second one, even though we need to pass it maybe in the next. That's what the error is all about. You have a variable, but you're not using it in the function. That's what the warning is all about. We're going to ignore this warning for now. Maybe in the next session when we're doing the actual factory method, we'll use this actual address variable. So we need a meta URI. So that's why I'm going to use the IPFS URL here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this link, create it. I'm just going to pass this link and what I'm going to do is like I'm going to use my own wallet address here. Okay. So we'll be watching the transactions from here first. Okay, it says like the transaction has happened. It's basically like from this, and the hash for the transaction is this one. The data is something we cannot read in this format. Okay. Let's reload. It'll take some time. So I'm just planning to do a tutorial on Solana that you guys can understand. The Solana is all about and how we can create contracts and NFTs and things. Okay, let's wait for a moment. I believe it should have been created by now. Okay, ERC transactions. Something that I have. Okay, there you go. So when you look at this, it says like the token transfer has happened from address of 0 to my wallet address. The token ID is 2 because I have already made one increment, and it says like this is the actual this is for a ERC721 token ID, and this is the ERC721 token. So if you click on it, it's gonna have the transfers, and it's also gonna have the contract. We haven't we haven't verified the code yet. So it says like we have one NFTs in total supply. So what we can do is we can actually create this again so that the counter will be incremented to like 3, so that that's what the factory is going to do basically. It's going to use the same instance and it's going to create another NFT incrementing the counter. Let's do it and see what happens. So I'm going to use the same metadata. I think before that, what we can do is like we can actually get the metadata from this token, isn't it? Why not? Let's see whether that function is working or not. So it's going to say await NFT dot get token URI. You need to pass the token ID, which is 2. If I'm not wrong, let me go ahead and check once. So token ID is 2. It's going to take. Okay. So this should actually return the token URI. Voila. So let's copy this address. Let's go to our. This will actually work from the browser itself because it's already in the IPFS public network. So this is the data which I've NFT'd now. So this is the actual image that's gonna be inside the NFT. Yeah, that was it. So I believe this tutorial was helpful for you guys. And in our next tutorial, what we're gonna do is like we're gonna take a look at the clones, and we'll understand how to actually clone this NFT contract. Yeah. So before that, if you guys wanted to know like anything, you can just put it in the comment, and if you guys like this tutorial, give it a thumbs up. So what I'm working on is like I'm just gonna go back to my previous tutorial. I'm gonna like change it into like make it much more comprehensible, because I feel like that was too long for anyone to follow. I'm just gonna break it into different sections so that you guys can follow up with those things. Thank you guys.